These podcasts just die. You have to have a willingness to stick to it. So in the last 2 years, we've released over 200 episodes. When people are quitting, what do? You just do more. And I figure I can do more.
Man, this is gold. So,
Ron Nussbaum, a visionary in the construction industry, has transformed the podcasting landscape.
With over 200 episodes of the Construction Champions podcast.
As a Marine veteran and founder of BuilderComs,
he's become the go-to expert for communication solutions, redefining how businesses connect and grow.
Most podcasts don't make it past 8 episodes.
why, in your opinion, is podcast that hard?
People have an idea, they start it, and they do not have the discipline to continue through on it.
When you bring on sponsors, then you need to share the spotlight. How do you see that?
This isn't a monopoly.
What recommendation would you give podcasters and wannabe podcasters?
I would say just keep it simple. I'm pretty basic and it's pretty simple, but that allows me the capacity to be able to do it. I think people get lost in.
Ron, how important is authenticity when producing a podcast?
For me, it is 100%. It matters. From the beginning, that was one of the things I wanted to have with my podcast. It's just like, I'm Ron Nussbaum, and like these guests are guests. So let's just not be anything more than that. Like, let's lean into that actually. And it creates a great conversation.
And so you're taking that to the next level. So some insiders information here. First time we talked, you were like, yeah, I'm editing my episodes very little. That's not the editorial choice of a lot of podcasters. So why is that important to you?
I think so. My podcast is made for the construction industry.
Right.
And my goal from day one was to present a podcast that was behind the closed doors, that made people feel like they were sitting in the room while a conversation was happening that would typically happen with the doors closed. Because in the construction industry, we're very secretive for some reason. We like to keep the doors closed. And I wanted it to come across as I'm sitting here, like I'm in this conversation with these guys. And that is one of the number one things our listeners tell us is they feel like they're sitting in the room with us having the conversation. So I think that's why that is important. It brings a rawness and a realness to it that I think a lot of podcasts lose.
So couldn't agree more with you, first of all. So why is the construction industry so secretive?
I do not know, man. Like it's just business. We just do construction work. I do not know. There is so many customers out there. There's so many opportunities, but everybody thinks they have like the golden nugget, the super secret thing. And I'll tell you what the super secret thing is I've talked to thousands of people that run construction businesses. Here's the golden nugget. You treat it like any other business, and your service just happens to be construction. The guys I see do that are the most successful. The people that treat it like construction's different than any other business and its stuff has to be different, those are the guys that just don't get it. They don't get the success. But the golden nugget is that at the end of the day, it's just business. That's all it is. We just happen to build shit. Like, that's it.
Can you talk to me about how you've used or not your experience as a Marine in the construction industry and in the podcast space?
There's a lot of things that transition from being a Marine and being in that world to construction. And believe it or not, to making a podcast. This stuff takes discipline. It takes a desire to actually do it and follow through. Those are characteristics that are drilled into your head when you're at Paris Island, when you become a Marine. So I believe it influences who I am right now when we're having this conversation. I
How?
was a different person when I left Paris Island than when I walked in. And without doing that, we wouldn't be having this conversation because I probably
Okay.
wouldn't have had the grit and determination and the discipline to turn Construction Champions podcast into a podcast that here we are having a conversation about it.
Man, this is gold. So why, in your opinion, is podcast that hard in the sense of like it takes discipline? Why is
So
that?
I think the numbers are, you'd probably know a little bit better, but I think most podcasts don't make it past 8 episodes. Like people have an idea, they start it, and they do not have the discipline to continue through on it because it's fun and exciting to say, hey, I have a podcast and I host a podcast. And then people start doing it and they realize, whoa, this is a lot more work than what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's why discipline's important. If you look at the successful podcasts, it's just like anything else, is you just have to keep putting in the work and you just have to produce something that people like. Like, and they don't even have to be like super, super like it. You just have to put something out there that makes people push play, and you have to keep doing it. Like these podcasts just die and they die over and over and over again. And you have to have discipline and you have to have a willingness to stick to it.
And speaking of which, you're taking this to the next level. So I want to kind of, how do you say, show off with that stat. So the real stat is 90% of podcasts won't make it past episode 3. And of those who do, 90% of them will not make it past episode 20. So 8 episodes is already a lot. It's better than 90% of podcasts, which is crazy. But as you said, it's like, it's actually harder. Yeah, starting a podcast is easy, especially in 2024, 2025, whenever we are releasing this episode. It's super easy. You take a mic and take your laptop mic, you record something and you publish it for free on all the platforms. But actually making it so that people listen to you and keep on listening to you and come back, that's a whole different ballgame. You're taking this to a whole new level, which is you're releasing 2 episodes a week. Why is that?
Because I figure it's my fastest path to getting it out there. I looked at it. So if most people fail and most people don't create 3, that's amazing. 3 episodes. Like, give me a break, guys. Come on. Are we just jumping on Canva and making a thing and saying that we have a podcast and then never doing anything ever again? Like, you have to have a passion for this. Like,
100%.
you can get rich doing podcasts, but at the beginning, you have to have a passion for it because you're not getting rich tomorrow from a podcast. So I do 2 episodes a week because that is how I'm going to win. Most people are doing 1 episode a week or less. And I figure I shorten my timeline to where I want to get to by doing 2. So in the last 2 years, we've released over 200 episodes when your typical podcast would have released 100 or less. So I'm doing it because I feel like that is my advantage. I can put out more content. We can put out more episodes. And eventually that backlog will become worth more than anything we can do. I have already had offers on it that I have turned down.
Really?
Yeah, and I'm just not like, I think it's worth a lot more than what I've been offered so far, but I'll continue to build that. And you got it. Like, that's how you win. When people are quitting, what do? You just do more. And I figure I can do more.
So there is so much to unpack here. First thing is, hey, let's play that game. Why not 5 episodes a week then, Ron?
If I could manage to get the guests and put all of this stuff out there, I would do 5 episodes.
Okay.
So I almost went to 3.
Okay.
I do it based on a backlog, and that's how I got to 2. Is I started at 1, and within 2 weeks realized this wasn't going to work because like I was 3 months out at 1 episode. I was going to be 4 or 5 months once I got through the first 30 days of doing recordings, and I'm like, I can't just sit on this. So I was like, I'll go to 2. It was shorten the release amount of times. I can always go back to 1.
Yep.
But the guests keep coming. And I'm just like, let's just stay at 2. I almost went to 3 at one point in time with 2 episodes a week. I was 9 weeks out.
Okay.
And I was like, should I go to 3? Like, can I do that? Like, it's a lot of work. Doing 2's a lot of work.
It is.
Getting to 3. So I would 100%, like if I had the capacity, I would do 5. If
Okay.
I was just doing, let's say somebody wrote me a check for my company tomorrow and Ron Nussbaum was just going to do podcasting.
How much do you want, Ron, on that check?
It would be a pretty good chunk of money.
I mean, if that's what it takes to get 5 episodes a week of the Construction Champions.
So I think I would just do it. Like if the funds were unlimited, say if I could just show up, record these episodes, we had the guests, I would do it because it's literally become one of my favorite things I get to do because I get to spend an hour with absolute legends, with absolute thought leaders, with the best of the best in the construction space. And we get to have a conversation about being a construction champion. Like, it's the funnest thing I do. So like, if I could do that every day, I would just do that. But I have some other obligations that I have to fulfill as well. And the podcast is just one of them.
And so you mentioned something earlier before as well, which is I got offered money for the podcast. I've always wondered, I mean, we had one prospect whose objective it was to sell the podcast. But I'm like, especially you, right? Like the construction champion. It's like, it's you, it's your brand. How do you sell a podcast? Like, how would that even work? Would you remain the host of it, but just not owning the rights of it? What's the deal like?
The offer was to buy 100 episodes. Like they had went through our catalog and was negotiating a purchase of 100 of our episodes that they wanted.
Okay. But to do what?
I don't know the exact outcome they were trying to create because I shut it down pretty early on because I was like, for one, like, I'm not selling you 100 episodes. Like, I know which ones you priority want, and I want to continue to maintain the rights to all this stuff.
Nice.
So, I figure I can get this podcast to a 7-figure exit.
Interesting.
Not that I'm planning on exiting it, but I think the value in the content is unbelievable. And I think the more content we build, eventually it really becomes something special. And I own it. And we'll continue to own it. And I don't know if I will ever sell it. It could be possibly part of the deal with my company, just because it kind of intermingles into that word because I'm in construction software, so I host a construction podcast. So it just intermingles in there, so it could become part of that transaction. And like I said, I would be interested in continuing to be the host. So, I mean, look, Joe Rogan did it, and he got everything that he wanted, and he still gets to host his podcast. So I think there's a word where that kind of stuff happens. Most people just don't make it past episode 3, so they can't even fathom it. Like, we're 200 episodes deep into this. I can start to wrap my mind around the fact that somebody would want this content.
Yeah. So you touched upon something interesting here. So how does your company benefit from your podcast? So for context, right? You're a SaaS company for the construction industry, correct? Can you actually briefly explain what you do and how it works, and then how it ties up with the podcast?
Yeah, so I own BuilderComs. It's a communication tool for the construction industry. So we do everything from documents, communication, photo, video storage, to building your own custom communication software for your construction business. So we're not just SaaS, we're a software development company as
Okay.
well, and service, where we come in and help implement this software in your business. How does the podcast help with that? For one, BuilderComs is the main sponsor of it. And I am the founder of BuilderComs. So Ron Nussbaum's name, I've been around the construction industry for coming up on about 15 years. I've been
Okay.
touted as a thought leader. I have built this reputation throughout the industry. I am now known as, the communication guy. Like, if you want to fix customer communication, you just need to go talk to Ron Nussbaum. Like, I use the podcast to leverage that. And one of the reasons I
Right.
have the podcast, there's two reasons. I was in a room with some guys that told me I needed a podcast, and they were not going to accept no for an answer. So
It's pretty badass.
I said yes. Two, I wanted to do more speaking. I wanted to be on more stages, especially around the construction industry and educational stuff. And the one theme that I found across the board was everybody that was speaking at these conferences all hosted a podcast. And I just said, I have to have that on my resume if I am going to go educate people in the construction space. So I became Ron Nussbaum, founder, CEO of BuilderComs, host Construction Champions podcast. That is now my email signature. So people know that I just don't own this company. I host this podcast as well. I'm not just this guy. Like, it starts to give you more leverage on your name. And my name helps my business. So that's how that becomes full circle.
So I love those chicken or the egg situations. So do you think those keynote speakers were speakers because they had a podcast, or because they were speakers, therefore they also had a podcast that was performing? Which one is it?
I think in the construction space, there's a lot of people that are speaking because they had a podcast. You're going to get the old dogs that have been around for a while that were speaking before podcasts were a thing, but now they have a podcast. But I think it has allowed, say, people like myself, who, like, I'm not a motivational speaker. I'm not a coach. I'm not you could say I'm a consultant, because we help construction companies implement software into their business. We consult them with that. But I don't do it by a trade. Like, I'm not out helping businesses grow, which is typically who your keynote speakers are. Is like, that's their offer. So they go talk about having a better life. Podcasting allows people like myself, who have all this industry knowledge, all this business knowledge, all of these life experiences, to be able to leverage that to a specific industry, say like construction, and put myself on the map. When before, I would just be doing what I was doing and not really putting my name on the map. It's a lot harder to go out and be like, oh, hey, I'm Ron Nussbaum. And well, who is Ron Nussbaum? Well, here you go. I have 2 years, 200 episodes of me talking. You want to know who Ron Nussbaum is? You're going to find out pretty quick. I mean, episodes are about 30 to 40 minutes a piece, 200. It's not going to be quick, but within 10, 15 episodes, you're going to have a pretty good feel on who I am. And people can start to understand that. And you don't have to. I get people reaching out to me all the time that listen to the podcast, that they're like, man, I love what you're doing on the podcast. We should talk, or just anything. Like, people will have a meeting with me and be like, I listened to your podcast before because I wanted to get a feel for you. And that to me, like, it just gives an opportunity there. Like, we're talking meetings that don't even have anything to do with the podcast or don't even have anything to do with business. Just like if I get introduced to somebody, if they go Google me, one of the things that comes up is the podcast, and people can listen to that. And what do you want people to do business with you, know, like, and trust you? What's the best way for them to do that? They spend 30, 40 minutes with you listen on a podcast. And then they get on a call with you and it completely changes the perception because now they feel like they know you because they just listen to you. And podcasts I mean, not that they're intimate, but like you just talk who you are, especially on Construction Champions. Like we started the show out talking about that, like that the authenticity of just talking about who you are and being that way lowers the barrier of entry. So anytime you can get people in front of that before you even meet them, it completely changes the outcome.
So, do you think everybody should start a podcast in 2025? Let me dig a little bit deeper into this question. Like, we arrive in 2000, right? And all the hype is to the blogs because you must have a blog, whether you're an individual, a company, whatever. It's like blog, articles, written content. And there is this recent Neil Patel video that explains that research for podcasts has just taken over research for blogs. Though you have much less podcasts than you have blogs still. The way you describe it, it's like it's opening doors. It's making a name for yourself. It's anybody Googling you will get to know you and see the legitimacy that you have with 200 plus podcast episodes released. Would you recommend anybody to start a podcast? The answer can be no, but interested to have your take on this one.
I think you got to have a reason, like you got to have a desire to have a podcast. Like if most people die out in the first 3 episodes,
That's true.
Like you got to have a reason to. You got to have a desire. I watch a lot of people with big teams decide they're going to do a podcast and it's very flaky. And I don't necessarily care for that because I think you lose a lot of the consistency. If you're going to start a podcast in 2025, have a schedule and release the episodes when they're supposed to be released. Don't be flaky about it. Don't be like, we're not on any schedule. We're just recording them and releasing them as they come. I think that is a place for error. Does everybody need a podcast? Absolutely not. Like, I probably don't technically need a podcast, but I have one, but I'm committed to it. I think a lot of people want to hear themselves talk. And I tried to do the solo podcast thing. And I tried to spin off like my own podcast where it was just Ron talking. And I was like, this is the most miserable thing ever. Like it's so much better if you're bringing guests on and having a conversation with them.
Sorry, go ahead.
I have a ordered in my mind where I can just do a podcast myself. Like where I can just sit there and talk and just like, this is Ron and this is his thoughts. And is there a place in the ordered for that? I don't know.
Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Not right now, I don't think. I think down the road there could be.
When somebody offers you a high 7 figures amount of money to buy your podcast and they say you have a non-compete, you cannot interview guests on a podcast for the next 2 years, that might be the time where you start a solo podcast. I mean, there is this whole thing about you interview a guest. So you create a relationship with somebody, right, that you so far didn't have with, or you strengthen a relationship with somebody you didn't know very well. You get to tap into their audience if they reshare because they enjoyed the time and the episode was great. But on the other hand, you're also putting the focus on them, right? So I see how I mean, we work mainly with podcasters who have like interview-based podcasts. But I see how a podcast that is solo can be like, hey, maybe it's growing a little bit slower, but it's 100% about my personal brand. And so the way you're talking about it is like, in your case, Ron, that wouldn't be completely unreasonable to have a solo podcast. I understand that's not the point, but that could make sense. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could. Like I said, I've dabbled in it, but it's just not something I went down the road to 100% be committed to. And I think what you just said about like building these relationships and opening up doors, that's one of the most amazing things about podcasts. And I'm gonna let a secret out of the bag for all
Ooh,
podcasters out there,
hyped.
or just for any business owner, is I had people I had been trying to get a call with for years that would never respond back to me. And as soon as I started my podcast and I sent them an email saying, hey, I would love to have you come guest on my podcast, I immediately got a response from them and I immediately had them on my calendar. We got to meet. We got to have a conversation and get to know each other that was completely non-business related. But it also it bridged some gaps. And I had some people tell me, like, I've been watching you. Like, I know what you're doing. I've been watching you. I know who you are. And I wanted to be like, well, why don't you respond to my damn messages then? Like, people don't understand the power that being able to invite somebody onto your platform to share their message with an audience, what that would do. And it's very powerful because, I mean, who really, all of everybody listening right now, if somebody emailed you and said, hey, I have a niche specific podcast in your industry, I would love to have you on as a guest. Are you just going to blow that email off, or are you going to respond back and be like, absolutely yes? Like, that's how powerful a podcast is as you're building it. And I sell nothing in any of my interviews. I give people an opportunity afterwards to be able to follow up with me. If they bring up that subject, I'm like, hey, you'll get an email. We'll set up a time. Let's talk about it. But this hour that we have set aside here,
No.
is it for that? It's for doing this podcast, learning about your story, learning about what you do, and talking about being a construction champion. Like, I think I've been on podcast interviews where like the hard sale comes in right before or right after it, or even during the podcast on like a service or something. And
Okay.
like, don't use your podcast for that. Use your podcast to actually do what it's meant to do. And that for me is our podcast is meant to impact the construction industry. It's meant to create construction champions that forever change the perception around the construction industry.
Amen to that. There is so many things, Ron. So first of all, don't sell on the podcast. Like, that's not the point. So in the case of podcast gurus, we work 90% on recommendations. So like, if the guest is not having a good time, they won't recommend another great guest. So first of all, that kills this. Second of all, just think about the audience. Like, the audience is here to get the insights from your guest, right? Who's done something successfully, which is probably the reason why you're interviewing them. And, spend a good time listening to one of their favorite hosts. Let's put it this way. If it becomes a sales pitch, you're ruining it. So don't do that. For your thing about opening doors, it's so funny. I'm bringing this anecdote so many times, but like, I interviewed Sean Flynn from the Silicon Valley podcast. And so same thing. He works only on recommendations. One deal for him is lots and lots of zeros. And he's like, my podcast works only on recommendation. And I was like, I was going around at some points trying to get to drink coffees with people, right? Silicon Valley, hey, you have 5 minutes for a coffee and so on. You get like not even an answer. And he said it like this during the interview. He was like, you ask somebody to come on your podcast. It could be their mother's funeral that will come and guest on your podcast. I was like, Sean, that's a bit extreme. Like, no, but like, it's crazy. It's crazy how easy it is, because I mean, you get value out of this. It's much better than like, hey, can you write a blog for my article or whatsoever? It's like, hey, come have a nice time, like having a discussion with me. You tap into my audience, right? So that's also value for you. There is a value exchange. It's just, it's gold. It's gold.
It is. And they get all the content. Like we make a blog about the podcast. We make a real we load them up with the content to
There we
share.
go. There we go.
I send everybody the entire episode so they can do whatever they want with it. Because at the end of the day, I think it's about getting the information out there and just like getting it out to the construction industry. So it is like people will drop everything to record an episode of a podcast, and it's pretty amazing. And I've guested on like 250 different podcasts at this point in time. I've been full circle when it came to podcasting, and this I'm somebody that 2.5 years ago, if you would have talked to me, I would have told you that's not my cup of tea. I hate my voice. This is not like that's just not me. And here I am. You could say thriving in this word.
Not doing too bad. But so I really like your take on like, hey, if I want to move 2 times faster, I'm just gonna release twice the amount of episode that your average Joe would release. What's next for the construction champion, Ron? Like, what is it that you're gonna do in 2025 to accelerate the podcast, if that's the idea at all? Or like, what advice would you give us to be like, hey, you see, like there is this that you can do that will really help. Anything that you're planning that you could share with us?
I think I'm in talks with a couple other different sponsors. So to grow that, and the podcast is just kind of a write-off, a break even. The goal is bring on a couple more sponsors and be able to streamline a lot more of this. So the more I take myself out of it, I have all the systems and everything in place. If I can take myself out of it and having to create all of this stuff, I can create more episodes. I think
Three a week?
maybe we could go to that. I'm thinking about maybe. So we
Spoiler alert.
talk about just the Ron Nussbaum. I've been kicking around the idea of doing about a 10-minute episode a week. That's just me and my thoughts on current construction industry trends. So we could get to 3 episodes a week. I think where I have done a really bad job that could drastically be improved, I think this is why our content is so valuable, is in the creation of other content from our recordings. I have pumped shorts out there. We do well when I put shorts out on YouTube. We drive a lot of traffic to our YouTube channel. But I don't put good shorts out, I don't think. Like it's not my thing. So I think in 2025, if we can
Interesting.
bring on a couple more sponsors, we will then roll those funds right back into the podcast, into management of it, content, everything that needs to be done around it, that some of it we don't do. And I think that's where podcasts should strive to get, unless you're a big corporation starting a podcast. If you're just somebody starting it, the first go in my mind, besides getting listeners and figuring out that people will listen to your podcast, is how do we get this to where we can continue to grow it? It's just like I'm a visionary and I delegate extremely well. Like
Okay.
I do all of this stuff, but I have no desire to. Like I would rather have somebody else do it. It's just about freeing up the funds in order for that to happen. I'm not going to rob Paul to pay Peters, but if I can get Peter to make the funds himself, boom, there we go. We'll make it happen. So in my mind, it's how do I get it to that point where it's monetized to the point where I don't have to worry about most of this stuff and I can just show up and do the interviews and we got guests. Like people reach out all the time. We have the guests. It's just continuing to grow that. And then who knows? Maybe we get to 5 episodes a week. Like
There we go.
every day.
Spoiler
I don't know,
alert.
maybe 7. We just one a day. I mean, there's people out there. Maybe some of it just starts to become Ron Nussbaum talking. It's hard to say what happens when you free that stuff up, when you have the ability, and then you bring some people in that understand it better than better than I understand it. And it's like, let's do this a little bit different. That's what I always think. What I tell people is you should do it long enough that you understand it. So when you hire somebody to do it, you can just cast your vision and let them run with it, because you're going to hire somebody that's really, really good at it. But you at least have an understanding of when they say we should do this, or that you can be like, all right, that makes sense. Or tell me more, because I don't quite understand that. You got to be able to make educated decisions. We got to be able to learn fast so we understand it, hire somebody to be able to do it, and then let them run with your vision for what it is. And if they're getting it wrong, chances are you're not clearly executing what your vision is to them. And that's where I want to get with the podcast, because then that frees me up to be what I'm really, really good at. And that's just the host and just the talent. You could say I'm just really good at being the talent behind the podcast. If we had somebody to do all the other stuff, it would clean it up, and we would probably skyrocket in our downloads and our YouTube channel, because you no longer have an amateur like myself doing it.
You're a bit severe with yourself, Ron, but no, that makes sense. So the thing you mentioned here, like bring on more sponsors. Yeah, I mean, the podcast is also a clear, I mean, it's not designed to be a funnel for your software company and your service company, but it's also helping it out, right? And you have it as a section on your website. I mean, there is an association between your podcast and your company. And you said it, right? The company is main sponsor of the podcast. So I'm interested into having your take on that, because when you have, okay, I have my business supporting my podcast and vice versa. When you bring on sponsors, then you need to share the spotlight. How do you see that?
I don't like, what would be wrong with that? This
So-
isn't a monopoly. Like,
No, fair. But so you share the bandwidth? I mean, I'm just interested in
I don't want, like, this podcast isn't necessarily about BuilderComs, and I
Okay.
don't want it to be all about BuilderComs.
Interesting. Yeah.
BuilderComs deserves a spot because it's my podcast and I'm the one grinding it out. Like that, and I didn't do that at the beginning.
Yeah.
And until I got approached about sponsorships, I was just doing the podcast, do it. And then I had somebody say, just take my money, basically. Like, come
Sure.
up with how much this is going to cost. I want to be part of this. And I was like, why don't I have my company's name on this? Like, if you look at most podcasts are just the companies. Like, so, but I don't want people to get on there. So you can, like, all sponsorships are more partnerships. Like, I turned some people down that I didn't believe aligned with Construction Champions and BuilderComs and on what we want to do. I believe in all these people that truly have a heart to move the construction industry forward. So anybody that's a sponsor on BuilderComs podcast or Construction Champions podcast is going to have that alignment. I don't have a problem. Like, it's not the spotlight. I'm not sharing anything. Like, these are 10, 15, 30-second clips during our podcast, and you get to be on the thumbnail.
Yeah.
I would say I am I'm not sharing the podcast or sharing the spotlight, is I'm giving an opportunity for our listeners to be able to help solve their problems through connections in my network in the podcast. That's how I look at it.
Pretty much nailed it, in my opinion. Love that. Ron, I think that was an absolute podcast masterpiece. What recommendation would you give podcasters and wannabe podcasters for, 2025, like an evergreen advice on podcasts for you who've done like it successfully in the construction industry? What recommendation would you give beyond go above 3 episodes?
Man, you really want more. I would say just keep it simple. Like,
Yeah.
I'm probably one of the most basic podcasters anybody will ever meet. I still record on Zoom.
Yeah, that's true.
I edit in CapCut. I don't do
Works, man.
anything. I use Canva to make my thumbnails. Like, I'm pretty basic and it's pretty simple, but that allows me the capacity to be able to do it. I think people get lost in like, what platform should I use? Like all of this, like we're using Riverside now, like people can use Riverside. It doesn't matter what you use. You just have to be able to use it. So like start with something you already know. There's something you're already using in 2024 here that you can do video recordings on, whether it's
100%.
Teams, Google Meet, Riverside, Zoom, like whatever you're using, like you can record on your iPhone. Like do something simple, don't overcomplicate it because you can always complicate it later. Like, but let the people that know complicate it because you don't know. Like, keep it simple until you can bring the people on or have people around you that can complicate it, but they can handle it. And that would be my advice to any podcaster out there.
Mic drop. Ron Nussbaum, ladies and gentlemen. Ron, if people want to find out more about Construction Champions, your software company, or about you, where should they go?
You can find Ron Nussbaum on any social media platform. Construction Champions podcast is out there as well. And then BuilderComs, COMS.com is my company's website. And that's where you can find out information on that.
We'll put all the link in the description. Ron, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's been fantastic.